So again, thanks for joining us at the Winds of Change event at Duke University, where we're doing deep dives into the practical realities of offshore wind development. This panel is going to focus on project financing of offshore wind projects. And again, the session is being live streamed and recorded. And now I'm going to hand it off to our moderator, Allan Marks. Allan.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to Duke University, to the Fuqua Business School, and to Nicholas Institute for putting this together. This morning, I thought we had some really, really interesting panels and presentations and lots of expertise. This afternoon, we're going to talk about two different things that are absolutely essential to making offshore wind, any particular project or the industry, a success. One of them is money. That's our panel. We'll talk to you about project financing. And then after that, we'll hear more about permitting and environmental protection. And obviously that involves not just protecting the environment, but also engaging other stakeholders that are involved in any development, but certainly in energy developments in particular. Our panel right now consists of me. I'm a partner at Milbank, working on project financing, including as counsel to Equinor on the projects that Mary Lou Fry discussed this morning, Empire and Beacon, about 3.3 gigawatts of projects that Equinor is developing jointly with BP off of New York and Massachusetts. We also do a significant amount of work with tax equity investors and lenders and other investors in these projects. So I expect in a moment to tell you a bit about what they're looking for in analyzing these projects for financing. Also on the panel next to me is Suedeen Kelly, who is was a three-term commissioner at FERC and is now a partner and co-chair of the energy practice at Jenner & Block law firm. And on this side, we have Ed Davis, who's with the U.S. Department of Energy in the Loan Program Office. And as you probably are aware, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the powers and ability of the Department of Energy, in particular through the Loan Program Office, but in other ways as well, to facilitate investments in new technologies and in clean technologies has been greatly expanded. So he'll tell us a bit about that in a moment. So with that introduction, let me spend about 10 or 15 minutes talking about how to mobilize capital for offshore wind. And I want to ask the question initially of how is offshore wind financing any different than any other large project financings one might find in the United States, whether that's in the renewable sector, say onshore wind or solar power, or for other things for that matter, infrastructure and other energy. I think there's several factors. One, global. We'll come back to that because other things are global too. But I think putting the United States in a global context here, I think helps to understand a bit more what's happening. Second is complexity, and there's different aspects to that. And third is scale. And as we saw this morning, these are very large projects and there's lots of things involved. So let's break that down for a moment. Offshore wind is not new. It's new to the United States, but it's not new to the world. Right now, we have an ambitious target. I would love it if we could hit it. I'm not confident we're on a trajectory to do so, of 30 gigawatts of new offshore wind capacity in the US over the next, let's say, 10 years or so, 10 to 15 years. If you look at the world right now, we have about 60 gigawatts, so double that amount, already installed, especially in Europe and in Asia, and particularly in China. And if you look at the growth, it's been significant. It's been significant over the last couple of years. In the last 4 or 5 years, about 70% of the growth in all wind energy capacity is in China, and 80% of the growth in offshore wind is in China. That's significant because if you're a global energy company, or if you're a global investment bank, or an investment fund, and you want to invest in renewables, and within that, you want to invest in wind, and within wind, you want to invest in offshore wind, you have a choice. Do I do it in Brazil or Poland or Taiwan? Do I do it in the UK or Germany or Denmark, which are more mature markets and have much slower growth now? Do I do it in the United States? And for the United States to be competitive in attracting that investment, we are starting now to do some things that will help to attract that capital. And that brings us to another piece of it being global. We heard about the Jones Act this morning. I think Charlie gave a tremendous introduction to a very complicated topic. That's just one of a number of ways in which we favor domestic industry and domestic labor, and maybe appropriately so. It's not a political statement, but the laws are meant to do a number of things at the same time, and they sometimes come into conflict. One point of the law is to accelerate investment in clean power. One element of our legal system is to allow stakeholders the ability to have input into whether, when, and where projects are developed so that they can meet a myriad of goals, including environmental justice, including other impacts on the environment, things we'll talk about later. We also want to enhance domestic manufacturing and domestic labor and job training and apprenticeship programs. And all of these things are incentivized, especially in the newest iteration of our tax credits, the investment tax credit, production tax credit, things that Suedeen will talk about in a moment. But it becomes a challenge because you can't increase the goals, increase the inputs, increase the requirements, and also do things faster. That acceleration goal then sometimes might come into conflict with it. From the point of view of investors, whether they're providing debt or equity capital, it was said this morning in one of the panels that they want certainty. And I would say that's actually probably, I disagree with that statement. I'm not sure they do. What they want is predictability. What they want is the ability to figure out what risks are, analyze those risks, make sure they're allocated contractually within these project structures to parties that are best able to handle them. And in so doing, reduce risk, not to zero, but to a point where it's manageable at the lowest cost. You're trying to boost the economic efficiency and therefore the return and the reliability and efficacy and efficiency of these projects. So to do so, contractual risk allocation becomes critical. So in developing one of these projects, they're called long lead time projects. That phrase was used this morning. What does that mean? It means it takes a long time. Yes, permitting is part of that. And permitting and entitlement processes are appropriately complicated because there's lots of things you have to take into account and lots of opportunities people need to have to be heard as to their views. And if they have concerns for those to be appropriately studied and addressed. But beyond that, one has to put together contracts with turbine supplies, with monopile supplies, with export cable systems, with onshore and offshore substations, and the list goes on. And I recall a meeting with an engineer. We were going over a complicated contract and they said, why are the lawyers and the bankers and the commercial people making these contracts so long and so complicated? And I drew a little picture on a piece of paper of a box and it had a wire coming out of one side and a little wind turbine on the other. I said, why do the engineers need all those pages of specs and drawings to make it so complicated? This is, to me, that's a wind farm. You know, there is complexity to it. So let's look at the complexity for a second. The complexity comes in the form of technical complexity. And in a marine environment with a single radial tether to your onshore substation and the transmission upgrades and things that are required on the land side of that to receive tremendous power with very large machines, now 15, even 18 megawatt towers to be erected. The complications of being, of course, in a marine environment for servicing that, not just for building it. You can imagine there's myriad technical difficulties or challenges, which again, can be overcome because they have been for 20 years in other parts of the world, but they do require, you know, an appropriate level of coordination. And the contracts and the negotiation of the contracts foster that communication and coordination. You do not have a single contractor that can wrap all of those risks. So the interface among the different vendors and suppliers and contractors and owners representatives and the lenders, technical engineers, when they become involved after financial close, all of that has to be coordinated and there has to be a framework to do so. So the job for a project sponsor becomes that much more complicated. They're not managing risk the way, say, a traditional oil and gas company might, by taking it all inside, being vertically integrated, hiring hundreds of people yourself and thinking you can do it best yourself. Instead, they're dealing with teams of outside vendors, outside suppliers, outside contracts, and that's a very different type of risk allocation and a different type of management skill. And that's why that, again, the contractual risk allocation of putting things on parties that can handle it and will charge a lower premium for doing so becomes important. When looking at any of these contract structures before anything's been built, lenders, people providing debt, so banks, I would say now also private credit from private equity funds or infrastructure funds that provide sometimes debt, not just equity, sovereign wealth funds, export credit agencies, all of them will be looking to know that risks are being effectively managed, and they'll look at it in two ways. First, assume everything goes as planned. What does the base case cash flow, the projections of costs, both the capital cost to construct and operating costs, variable and fixed along the way, and the revenues that are coming in from the sales of power, how do those work over time? And if you can project out for the 20 or 30-year life of the plant that you will have more revenues than you have operating costs, that delta, that gap is available to service the debt, to pay back the loans that need to be borrowed to build the project, to pay interest on those loans, to pay the fees for the bankers and yes, the lawyers that put it all together, and also to have sufficient remaining cash flow available for distribution to the equity holders, to the sponsors. And the equity holders are taking more risk, but they have a potential for more return. The lenders providing the debt are very risk averse because they don't share in the upside. At best, they get paid back, and they're afraid that they might not get paid back. So they're going to be very cautious and require that there be extra reserves and contingencies built into that base budget, right? So when they're all looking at this bundle of contract rights and this skill involved, they will rigorously look to make sure that these projects are feasible if things go as planned. The second way that it will be done after that are the analysis of, well, what if things don't go as planned? What if the contractors are late? What if there's a supply chain disruption and I can't get my European blades over here to the port on the Atlantic coast of the United States? What if there's labor disruptions or a pandemic? Suddenly people are now aware that we could have pandemics again. We'd forgotten that for a while. And whatever the problem was yesterday is the thing they're usually most worried about. But the thing that may be the problem is not necessarily something we expected. And there's a difference here, right, between risk and managing risk, which are things where probabilities matter, where you can fix problems and anticipate them proactively, and uncertainty, exogenous things you did not expect to have happen. And there are some things like extreme weather events that we used to consider uncertain and unlikely. And now perhaps with climate change, we consider them to be much more regular and expected. And so contract terms and negotiations around excuses people have for these things and how they manage them are increasing. So in negotiating contracts, the force majeure provisions, the built-in schedule and the float that's entitled to suppliers and builders that comes in, and inflation around all of that has greatly increased both costs and the time that it will take or is projected to take to put these things in place. So the downside scenario, the what if things don't go as planned situation also has to be analyzed to see what are the magnitudes and probabilities of the events that could happen that could disrupt or delay the realization of the revenues sufficient to repay the debt and to provide a return to the equity. So as a result of this being global, as a result of very large scale, and the billions, not just millions or hundreds of millions of dollars required for many of these projects, and as a result of, well, I guess we put the complexity, the scale, and the global nature of this all together, this is a very different industry than, say, an onshore solar power project, because it requires very large, sophisticated, well-coordinated companies and their partners to be able to pull it off, right? So it's not a matter of three people getting together with a telephone and a plot of land and an interconnection agreement in the middle of Central Texas. They want to put some solar panels on it and they can call somebody and they can get some tax equity in, and it's about a $60 to $100 million project and they're often done. And the whole thing takes 2 years, right? Start to finish. This is different. This is fundamentally more complicated. And the companies that are winning the leases with BOEM for new offshore sites, the companies that are supplying this very sophisticated technology, whether it's, again, wind turbines or anchoring systems or cable laying things, or the vessels that are bespoke to go with it, they're all very large. They know exactly what they're doing. But even for them, it's very complicated to put it all together. Let me close on the financing bit just to say that notwithstanding all of that, I'm actually fairly optimistic because I have seen both the legal and regulatory response to a lot of the challenges and uncertainty. I've seen the way the companies are managing it, and I've seen the tremendous appetite on Wall Street and also among non-US investors and lenders to invest in particular in offshore wind and in particular in the United States. I think the markets that are the most ahead currently are the Northeast, to some extent the Central Coast as well of the Atlantic Coast in the United States, and now California, where I'm from, where we've had the first 5 leases or lease areas, had a successful auction completed on that, and the leases have that yet to be issued, but they will be by BOEM. And of course, great differences between East Coast and West Coast in a lot of ways, but I think overall we are going to have a lot of work, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities for the companies and the people interested in stepping up to do it. So we'll take questions later. Let me, with that, turn it over to Suedeen Kelly and hear a bit more in detail about some of the tax credits and other incentives from the federal government. And maybe during the Q&A, if there's time, we'll look at this interface also between the federal government and state and local governments. I think does not really get enough discussion, but is an important part of how the financings and developments also occur. So Suedeen.
Thank you, Allan, and thank you for your overview of project finance. I learned something. I've known that it's complex, and now I understand that offshore wind is of scale. And I was thinking as I was preparing to deliver my remarks that if any of you are like me, or at least like I was when I was in law school, the prospect of sitting through any period of time listening to somebody lecture about tax was incredibly boring. So I have come over the course of my career to actually appreciate that taxes is pretty exciting. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which Congress passed last year, provides a lot of tax credits for clean energy technology, which is actually very exciting as we look to our future and our clean energy technology potential for building out. Just like in a nutshell, what's a tax credit, or how? There are lots of ways to think about tax credits, but I find it helpful to think about you're going to build a project. It's going to cost you $3 billion. If you get a 30% tax credit, which is $90 million on your $3 billion, you've lowered your cost by $90 million to $2.1 billion. So when we're talking offshore wind and the prices and the costs and the investment that's involved, a tax credit is particularly significant. The Inflation Reduction Act had 2 provisions that provided for tax credits related to offshore wind. Well, they didn't specify offshore wind, they specified wind. So one of these tax credits is actually not only applies to wind facilities, it's a technology neutral investment tax credit for projects that do not emit carbon placed in service after 2024. And of the various kinds of projects that it covers, the statute says a facility which is used for the generation of electricity, offshore wind, no carbon emissions. There's also, there was in the code previously a production tax credit available for wind. And the Inflation Reduction Act gave wind facilities that used to rely on that provision for a production tax credit an option to have an investment tax credit. And Congress used similar language for facilities using wind to produce electricity constructed before 2025. What Congress didn't do was define facility used for the generation of electricity. This has led to a lot of uncertainty about whether the delivery system, the system of cables gathering the electrons from the turbines offshore and gathering them and taking them to shore, is covered by the investment tax credit. And if it is, could you have a company or a consortium of companies develop and own and operate the delivery system, and that company or consortium be different from the turbine owner and operator and still get the investment tax credit? So why is this important? Why is this an exciting question? I actually represent a coalition of entities that would like to develop the wind delivery system for offshore wind. Con Edison Transmission, Shell Renewables, RWE, Ocean Winds, Exelon, and PSEG. Most of them are looking not off the coast of North Carolina, but off the coast further north. Offshore delivery system is 30+% or more of the total project cost. So if you take a $3 billion offshore project, $1 billion of that is for the delivery system. If you can get a 30% investment tax credit, you've just cut the cost by $300 million. So you've reduced your cost. I know it sounds like not a whole lot, doesn't it, when you talk about $1 billion, but you've reduced your cost from $1 billion to $700 million. It's really significant because ultimately the cost of the facility is going to be borne by the customers who take the electricity produced by offshore wind. And frankly, whether or not the investment tax credit covers the whole development can have, at these dollar investment prices, can have a real impact on whether or not offshore wind is viable in the US. So let's talk about those two issues, and maybe the next slide. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. This is a diagram of what that offshore wind delivery system looks like. So again, the first question is, should the ITC apply to this delivery system? And what you see on this diagram are cables coming off of the turbines that go to a platform or a substation. And that platform or substation gathers the electricity from a number of turbines. At least this is what we would call good design. And then the three substations or the three gathering points are connected to each other so that if one goes down or one has a problem or one gets overloaded, you can move it to another one back and forth. And then you bring them to a point of interconnection through one cable or more than one cable to a point of interconnection onshore. The reason that this is an issue is not only the fact that Congress didn't define what it meant by a facility, but also because during the passage of the legislation, there was an amendment proposed to the Inflation Reduction Act to provide an investment tax credit for transmission. That amendment didn't pass. So there's a concern that maybe there's a concern that, what is this delivery system? Is this transmission or is it not transmission? If it is transmission, did Congress not want the the investment tax credit to cover it? Or did Congress want the investment tax credit to cover it? There is, at the same time, thinking that onshore wind has an entirely different delivery system than offshore wind. Onshore wind, most of the time, the turbine is connected. Sometimes the turbine's directly connected to the transmission line nearby. Other times, a couple of turbines are gathered together and connected to a nearby transmission line. That is called a generator lead line, and there's pretty much a consensus, the IRS hasn't weighed in yet, that a generator lead line is part of a facility used for the generation of wind, and it's not transmission. Here, getting onto shore is a whole different issue. And the electrons move one way. So arguably that's not transmission, because usually in transmission, electrons can move back and forth different ways. Except you see those little secondary cables there? Their electrons can move back and forth. So a further question is, if it can move back and forth, is it not a delivery system? Is it transmission? Is it not eligible? Or if it's not eligible, then is the whole system not eligible? Or is only that cable not eligible? This design is called a mesh network. And if Treasury were to interpret the investment tax credit to not apply to the mesh system, what you would have would be an incentive to be much less efficient in how you design your delivery system, because your incentive would be to take one generator lead line from each turbine to shore. Much less efficient, more costly, less resilient, less expandable. So the other issue is, and it's a quirk that's in the existing statute. In the existing statute, the old provision that provided for production tax credit said that the production tax credit goes to the owner of the wind facility or the owner of the turbine, because that's what produces the electrons. So enter in this amendment, it doesn't change owner. Now, the intent of Congress was entirely different, but the question is, did Congress really mean to restrict the investment tax credit to the delivery system to require only one owner? Well, that would be bad policy, right? Because we're talking a lot of money that you need for an offshore system. And it's going to be hard for one company to raise the capital needed just for the, say, the $2 billion for the turbines, let alone the $3 billion for the turbines and the wind system. And if you think about the implications of that, it would mean that only one company could do it. And probably the company that's really good at developing turbines is not so good at the delivery system, and vice versa. The theory behind arguing that, or the policy behind arguing or asking the IRS to interpret the statute to cover the whole wind delivery system, is that that infrastructure is an integral part of the facility, and it's necessary to get the electricity to shore. And there's no sellable product until the electricity is brought to the injection point or the point of interconnection onshore. I was reading on the airplane flying in this morning, today's utility dive, and the top article was quoting Jigar Shah, who Ed knows well, who's head of DOE's loan program. And he was talking not about the investment tax credit, but about a responsible wind delivery system. And what he said was, we want to see mesh delivery systems developed because they're more cost effective, they're more efficient, and they're more resilient. He said, we do not want to see radial lines from each turbine or group of turbines to get to shore. And we don't want to see that many interconnections at a point onshore. We want them all, as many as possible, to be put into one cable to limit the adverse environmental impact, the adverse impact of others who are using the ocean and are concerned about the cables underneath. So the coalition's pitch is that our tax policy should drive reasonable investment, and that reasonable investment offshore wind means an investment that supports a reliable, a resilient, and a cost-effective wind build-out. So the other question is, or maybe the first question I asked is why is this important? It's important, and it's important that we get the answer now. As Allan mentioned, if you have uncertainty about how much it's going to cost, particularly uncertainty at this magnitude of investment, banks are less willing to lend. Equity investors are less willing to invest. They don't know, is my project going to cost me $3 billion or $2.1 billion? But the other important fact at the moment is that there are a number of states on the East Coast, New Jersey, New York, and the New England states that are very interested in contracting now for offshore wind development and for entering into contracts with these developers for the output of their offshore wind facilities. And they have been stalled in issuing contracts because of the uncertainty around whether the investment tax credit covers a third of the cost that goes into the wind delivery system. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Suedeen. And it's interesting hearing you talk about tax credits. And I know we're going to hear in a moment from Ed, about what the Loan Guarantee Program Office is doing. I think it's worth taking a moment too to recognize there are different ways of subsidizing. If you're a government, as a matter of public policy, there's different ways of attracting private capital and subsidizing, in effect, or incentivizing, better word, the development of something, including offshore wind, right? One way is through our tax code. That's with the history of the investment tax credit, the production tax credit, now broadened to other sources of power generation. But that's traditionally been a way we do it. There's maybe not the most efficient way and we're the most transparent. And it's the reason why you have people that ordinarily would provide loans or debt buying something called tax equity, because in order to benefit from tax credits, you need to be an equity owner of something, right? And that's why it gets complicated and keeps people like our law firm in business.
Helen, can I mention
that
I agree with you? And in our country, we've found it very difficult to get an energy policy at the federal level because of the diversity of interests. It's hard to get everybody on the same page. And the last time we did it was in 2005. But looked at that way, the Inflation Reduction Act is an energy policy legislation where Congress said, we want clean energy technology in America. And we're going to do it by incentivizing it through tax credits.
Now, another way, of course, is for the government to be more directly involved in providing capital. And to a large extent, the Department of Energy is a vehicle that has been used for that. Back in the financial crisis, we used cash grants from the Treasury Department in lieu of tax credits as another way of doing it. And of course, there's the renewable portfolio standards and things states are doing or not doing to attract investment into renewables in their jurisdictions. Ed, can you tell us a bit about what you do and how you're approaching this at the DOE?
I'm happy to try, but I want to say I'm 100% for mesh systems grid.
Thank you.
And with that, probably I should state a disclaimer, I guess. All my remarks I make here today are personally my own and do not represent the official policy of the Department of Energy. So if we can click. Yeah, I would like to maybe show of hands from the audience as to how many of you are aware of the mission or program of the Loan Programs Office. Got one, two, well, quite a bit. Good. Jigger would be pleased with that. So the Loan Programs Office was established in 2005 as part of that Energy Policy Act. And there was a bipartisan agreement in both the House and the Senate that saw a need for an agency like the Department of Energy to pick up where the Department of Energy's had a long, successful record of basic science, research, development, and even demonstration. But at the time where those technologies were ready to enter into the commercial marketplace, quite often for the first of a kind commercial deployments, there wasn't adequate financial support from the private sector. And so the Congress passed as part of the Energy Policy Act, a program establishing the Loan Programs Office. And today it's still an obscure office within the Department of Energy. It's one of the only offices that doesn't operate based on grants. It's actually a loan program. And with that, there's a responsibility to, in all of its loans, to determine a reasonable prospect of repayment as one of our eligibility criteria, which we'll talk a little bit more later. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this first slide. I'm going to stay on it just a few minutes here, if you don't mind. I mentioned that the Department of Energy has a basic research mission. It has, about 17 national laboratories. It has over 10,000 engineers and scientists. So it has a very strong bench. When the department was established back in 1977 by Jimmy Carter, there was, in terms of the energy industry, at least the oil and gas industry was a little skeptical. They felt that the department might try to control prices. So there was a lot of, I would say, concern that the Department of Energy might move in to control prices of delivered energy in the United States. I think the mission of the Department of Energy has really grown over the years. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act represents one of the most major pieces of legislation, energy legislation, that the Congress has passed in the last several decades. So this bridge to bankability, it really is the mission for the Loan Programs Office. It actually starts, way before the demonstration of innovative technology. So I mentioned the Department of Energy is responsible for conducting basic research. And so the development of new cutting edge technologies begins with that cutting edge basic sciences, applied research, development, and then from development to demonstration. And then from this demonstration where you have had an effective demonstration project, you see the first of a kind, what we call first of a kind commercial deployments. And at that point in time, quite often commercial banks are reluctant to lend, or if they're willing to lend, they want a seemingly high commercial interest rate for projects that have not yet fully been commercialized and introduced in the marketplace. That's why we have the Loan Programs Office. So we really pick up at the point where these projects have been adequately demonstrated at scale. You can think of the Loan Programs Office as a sort of a project finance bank, within the Department of Energy, a green bank. I think it really has, from all perspectives, has become a green bank. It relies on project finance to a great degree for its loans. We'll talk more about to provide debt capital in conjunction with equity to provide the financing for these new energy projects. And the goal for the program is to try to encourage the deployment of debt capital along with equity capital up to $100 billion in each of these new technology innovation sectors. And today we're funding up to over a dozen clean tech vertical sectors that are being deployed in the United States. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Got the bug. So the eligibility criteria, we have basically simply 4 overriding eligibility criteria. Number 1, that the project has to incorporate and use innovative technology. We'll come back and maybe talk a little bit more about that. Second, these are the 2 public policy missions which I spoke of. The second is that the project has to result in a meaningful reduction in greenhouse gases compared to a business as usual case. Meaningful reduction would be somewhere in the order of 10 to 15% greater than the business as usual case. All of our projects have to be located in the United States. They can incorporate components manufactured abroad. That's not a problem. But they
for
have
this
to be
purpose, in the United States means the outer continental shelf as opposed to Jones Act United States.
Right.
Yeah. The bigger country.
Yeah, even our territories like Puerto Rico probably would be considered to be in the United States. And lastly is the requirement that this in fact is a loan program. So one of the requirements is that the office, before issuing or granting any loans, has to find that there's a reasonable prospect of repayment. So those on the innovation criteria, innovation is classically defined under our rule for our program, something that's unique, it's novel, something that's been newly developed, designed, invented. That's the classical definition. Or there's an alternative definition is that it employs a combination of technologies that results in a significant improvement in productivity or value. So it's either one of those or it could be a combination of both. That's the innovation criteria. We have very flexible loan structures. We can lend up to 80% of the total project eligible cost. We have very long tenors up to maximum of 30 years. We can lend up to 80, I mentioned 80% of the total project cost, but the leverage, the financial leverage is really determined by the analysis of the underwriters in terms of the project's projected cash flows. We are a patient investor. We hold on to our loans. We don't sell off our loans. We're a partner throughout the process from beginning to end. As I mentioned, quite often some of these projects, because they're the first of a kind, do encounter unexpected difficulties in their startup and early implementations. And that's where the 10,000 engineers and the 17 national laboratories really come involved, because we can solve any problem and have done a lot of work on a number of our projects. We have a very successful track record in terms of funding our projects. It's less than 7% default rate, which is in the lending business is very, very good. As a matter of fact, it's outstanding. Next slide. So our portfolio today is we have over $126 billion worth of 126 projects, over $120 billion in potential total project capital cost. Very successful. This represents an effort over the last 2 years by this administration to really focus on this program and to jumpstart its project pipeline. Next slide, please. This slide really sort of depicts sort of the process. It's a rather straightforward process. We call it a two-step process, or part one, part two. First part of the process begins with the potential borrower applicant submits a application that's intended to address the technical eligibility criteria, principally the innovation eligibility criteria, as well as the greenhouse gas reduction criteria. We'll examine those two and we'll review those, and within a reasonable amount of time, 45, 60 days, we'll issue a determination, and assuming that the project is found to be eligible, we'll invite the applicant into what's called a part two. Part two phase is really focused on the financial viability of the project and its potential for repaying the loan. To the extent that we determine that the project is financially viable and is ready to proceed, we'll enter into what is called a due diligence phase, where that constellation of contracts that gets involved in project financing comes into play. We'll bring in the advisors, the legal advisors, the lawyers will go through all of those contracts with a fine-tooth comb. And then if there is determined that it's a loan that we can underwrite, we'll issue a conditional commitment, and then we'll go to financial closing. So the back part of that process really resembles sort of well-established private sector lending practices by the project finance industry. So that's a real shortcut presentation of the program. We're really encouraged. The Inflation Reduction Act with the bipartisan infrastructure bill has really provided significant increase in resources. The loan programs office has tripled in size. Today it's about 150 professionals. We have over $100 billion in lending authority across all of our clean tech verticals that we can lend money to, debt capital, and $250 billion in a program that was newly established on the IRA that's intended to fund, it's called the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Portfolio Program, where we fund for critical energy infrastructure that has ceased to operate. We're able to provide up to $250 billion in debt capital. So it's a really important program. You'll hear more about it in the months and years to come. So with that, I'll pause, and hopefully there'll be some questions with regards to the program.
Thank you very much. There are questions coming in already. If you have not done so, there's instructions on the screen to visit slido.com with the code 1048171, 1048171, and ask questions. We've got several in, and I want to maybe address the first one to you, Suedeen, with respect to when. There are a couple of questions about Section 48 and what's eligible for ITC and what isn't. And the question, I guess, at the end of the day is, when do you expect to have further guidance from Treasury on some of those questions you raised?
That's a great question. As you might imagine, Treasury is absolutely inundated with requests for guidance. And so our strategy at Treasury is to see if we can get Treasury to move our question to the top of the list, and to decide as a matter of policy that they'll give guidance on a step-by-step basis instead of waiting and issuing one whole guidance document. And so part of our appeal to Treasury is to tell them why it's so important, and which is why I mentioned that there are these states, the New England states, New York and New Jersey, actively looking right now to enter into contracts with offshore wind developers. And so they need to know now.
Yeah. And I would say in an inflationary environment, time really is money for a lot of developers. And as long as there's questions, I think it makes it harder to justify investment decisions for some. There's other areas that the Inflation Reduction Act where the investment tax credit is made, getting the full value of it. There's a base, and then there's bonuses available. And some of those bonuses may depend on, for example, whether a project's located in an area which is historically impacted adversely by energy, or maybe a transition away from coal into something else. There's all sorts of questions that need to be answered to implement this rule. It's a very complicated statute for Treasury to give guidance on. There's lots of different things in it that they're looking at. Another one is on supply chains, right? So if you use domestic equipment, you can get more credits. Terrific. But what if that equipment's not made in the United States today? Perhaps then you are eligible for a waiver, and there's all discussions around that, because there is an impetus to get projects built now using whatever is available, but not have that be open-ended. Still have there be some time pressure for the development of domestic manufacturing, domestic jobs, and job training, and the things that are envisioned by the bill. One of the questions came in, and I want to take it myself, if I may, to kind of double back on the financing. And the question was, when do people get their return? When do the investors get their money back? And so I want to be a little clearer than I think I was before in breaking it down. So the project sponsors, the developers of the projects, are spending significant amounts of money in the pre-development and development stage before they have reached financial close, before they've borrowed any money. And that's just money out the door being invested in setting up their teams, in negotiating and signing contracts with suppliers and vendors, going through the permitting process, and the public stakeholder engagement, and all the different things that have to go into one of these projects. Again, no different than any other project, except that it's significantly larger, more complicated. At financial close, many of those costs are recovered in the form of a development fee paid out of the loan proceeds. But at the same time, those sponsors will be committing, along with the banks who are committing to make loans, the sponsors will commit to provide additional equity money equal to the minimum equity required for the project. So if you have a $1 billion project and you assume that 70% of the value of the project is borrowed money from banks or bonds, probably banks in this market, then there's still 30% of the money which the equity investors will commit to fund. And that total 100% will include not just the project costs and not just the recovery of the pre-development costs from the initial development fees, but also contingencies and reserves that are built into the project. Now go forward a few years and the project's finished. It's built, it's online, and it's able to generate electricity. At that point, the construction lending might be repaid and refinanced into a long-term loan. Now, that sounds nice and simple. And of course, at that point, then the banks start to get repaid, because during construction, there's no interest payments, it's capitalizing. And the interest payments will come when the debt is starting to be serviced, once there's revenues to do so, and dividends can be paid. But now we have to layer tax equity on top of this, and that disrupts that traditional model, because the tax equity investors are investors if the sponsors of the project cannot use the tax credits themselves. They may sell equity interests in the project to other investors who can use the tax credits. Large banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, maybe some corporates. One of the nice things about the Inflation Reduction Act creating a 10-year runway, at least, for investment tax credits and production tax credits, is it may broaden the scope of investors potentially in tax credits. And there's also transferability provisions that can allow this to be done annually. But essentially, the tax equity is repaid during the first 5 to 10 years of the project's life. And it's after that the sponsors will receive, the original developers will receive most of their returns. So they have a significant but back-ended interest. Lastly, I don't think it's fair to leave off the suppliers and vendors. They are not really sources of capital. Vendor financing is very expensive money, and most vendors will tell you that. So, but nonetheless, the timing of when a supplier or a vendor or a builder receives their funds will be tied to progress and payments and milestones during the construction period or during the supply period for them. And some of them will be early on, providing big equipment. Others will be later because they're installing it and erecting it, whether it's onshore substations or the offshore wind turbines, whatever that might be. And it's a point of negotiation what those payment curves look like. If they're front-ended, that means that the supplier is getting paid pretty much cash neutral along the way and doesn't take that much residual risk of non-payment. And ideally, that's a lower priced contract. The more the payments are back-ended, the more you're really having your vendor or supplier provide some kind of financing. You're also giving them significant incentive to perform. and to complete the job properly, because their profit will depend on it. But that then may reduce the interest during construction on the money that's being borrowed from banks, but it may also increase the contract price. So that's kind of the trade-off that people are weighing. That's a short answer to a good and complicated question that we had.
We had go back. So in terms of specifically for wind-related projects, offshore wind-related projects, the type of project costs that are eligible to be financed by the Loan Programs Office would include not only the turbines and the wind farm, but all of the supply chain infrastructure that goes along with it, including the following. I'll just deployment of fixed bottom and floating offshore wind farms, yes. Full component supply chain, including manufacturing of turbines, monopiles, towers, nacelles, blades, foundations, and subsea cables. Advanced steel production utilizing CCUS or other methods to decrease greenhouse gases. Transmission upgrades, including HVDC deployment. Also including, we're in early discussions in terms of wind turbine installation vessels. Also including the upfront project development costs that you described, siting, site suitability studies, site-specific investigations, site improvement, site prep, site characterization, site permitting, early engineering, technology assessments, professional services, conceptual design, preliminary design, and detailed design. And along with that, including contingencies and escalation. So all of the above.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Are there projects that, the question came in, are there projects, offshore wind related projects that either Block Island, earlier ones that either the Loan Programs Office was involved in, or ones that are in your pipeline now that are?
We have several in the pipeline right now, as a matter of fact. More coming our way, by the way, I'm told, right? So we're engaging. The LPO is leaning into this. And for those of you that are interested in talking to me after this session, I'll be happy to give out my business cards, and please look me up. Yeah.
Thank you.
We're open for business.
You actually are. It's really kind of nice to see, I must say. Having worked a lot with in the 2008-2010 timeframe with
Right.
DOE on the loan program at the time, it's nice to see it back and enforce. Suedeen, a question came in also, and given your background at FERC, I think you can probably give not just a regulatory answer to this, but also kind of either a physical or a state-related answer. Projects on the Atlantic coast of the US, in the north, Massachusetts in particular, New York, seem to be ahead of the ones in the mid-Atlantic. And there's certainly more talk in the financial markets, I'll verify, about those projects. Why is that?
Great question, actually. 2 reasons. But before I give you the 2 reasons, I think it's helpful to think about the fact that if you are a developer, you are not going to begin developing a $3 billion project unless you're pretty darn sure that somebody is going to buy your output. You don't build a $3 billion project on spec. So what has happened in New England and New Jersey and New York is those states have their own individual clean energy standards. It's not necessarily a mandate, but it's close to, and they want to reduce carbon in their electric generation significantly. Number one. Number two, those states are willing to put their money where their mouth is, if you will, and enter into contracts to offtake the electricity on behalf of their citizens. That's the primary reason that they're moving ahead, because the developers see that they can sell their product and at a price where they can recover, or at least part of their output. The other reason is that in that part of the country, as opposed to the Southeast, there are 3 wholesale bid-based auction markets available to electricity generators. In other words, let's say you have a contract on your wind facility for 80% of the output. That other 20% that you're capable of producing, you can sell into a market. The Southeast doesn't have that market. So the Southeast generators are dependent solely on contract off-takers. And there tend to be fewer of them, right?
Very good. Thank you. Another came in about environmental covenants. So, obviously we'll hear a lot in a moment about the permitting process and environmental impacts, but in a financing context, and maybe I'll ask you first, Ed, from when you commit and fund a loan, how do you deal with environmental requirements? So maybe Suedeen, if you have a thought on that as well, and I may have some too.
Well, that's a good question. The Secretary of Energy issues the guarantee, and the action of the Secretary to issue a conditional commitment along with the guarantee is considered a major federal action. So Loan Programs Office is required under NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, to prepare a environmental report. It could be as much as an environmental impact statement, or it can be an environmental assessment. The program over its last 15 years has never had a project where the permitting or the satisfaction of that requirement has delayed a financing of one of our projects. Most of the time, we will adopt another federal agency's environmental report. We'll adopt a state or local evaluation of the environmental impacts associated with the project, and preparing our own internal environmental report that's compliant with the National Environmental Policy Act.
Let me stay with that for a second, because and one of the nice things too about the bipartisan infrastructure bill in November of 21, it sort of enshrined this. We already had the federal dashboard, but it enshrined a lot of the coordination among the agencies as one federal action. If there's an offshore wind project that has a lease and a COP from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, from BOEM, obviously then there's already been environmental work done. I assume then if that project somehow are involved in subsequently getting a loan guarantee, that you would just
adopt it.
You just
Yeah,
adopt
we would not do it again.
So there's no delay,
no duplication.
no delay, no duplication.
There was no duplication.
Right. Good.
And is that the same? Is that similarly true for the cables that come from the offshore to the point of interconnection onshore, or it's a different process, right? Than a lease process? Yeah.
Well, if it's connected to the project that we're financing, for which the guarantee would be provided in the conditional commitment, we would adopt. Our practice is to adopt any existing environmental report that has examined the impacts associated with the project, quote unquote. If that project includes the transmission back to the shore, we would adopt another agency's evaluation of those environmental impacts, state or local evaluations as well, as part of our own. And if there's gaps, we would have to have our own staff assessment of that.
Yeah, and this is where this interjurisdictional coordination becomes really important, also between state and local, or state and federal, because the landing sites, the onshore substations, and any of the onshore improvements associated with this, and the few miles that are state waters that are not federal waters, those have state requirements, and they may or may not be highly coordinated with what the federal requirements are, and there may be differences as far as what constitutes the project that's being approved. That's certainly something which I'm sure some of the panelists on our permitting panel will be able to delve into that in great detail if people would like to do so. Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
Good. The last question that came in from folks that I kind of wanted to address in the time that we have, and I'm going to kind of combine some of these together with also a question that I have, which is, if you had a magic wand and you could change something in the current regime in the areas in which you're dealing with this, that would make financing either easier or cheaper or more robust, what would it be? Suedeen?
I'd have Treasury give me a guidance that the ITC covers the entire mesh wind delivery system. Thank you.
So it'd be the right answer and quick.
Yes.
Okay, good.
So that's a really good question, and thanks for the opportunity. Again, this is my own personal view. I want to say. So having thought about it here for a second, so it doesn't necessarily pertain to offshore wind, but another clean tech sector, hydrogen. I think we were talking about this before earlier.
Yeah.
So for the hydrogen hubs that are funded under the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that was enacted, they have $7-8 billion. Any program that is receiving federal grants, by definition, is not eligible to have LPO loan. In other words, to put it in the vernacular, you can't repay a loan with other sources of federal funds. So that's a no-no. And vice versa. I understand that the hydrogen hub procurement that's out there, the funding opportunity has a restriction on them not receiving any loan disbursements. So it's crisscross applesauce on that. So yes, that's one I'd like to see some amelioration of the restriction.
Why? I mean, how would that make a difference as far as deployment of the new technology?
Well, for
Hydrogen or-
example, in some areas, like for advanced nuclear projects, quite often those projects are receiving federal grants or federal support. They could be located on federal lands.
Mhm.
There could be federal offtake. I mean, some portion of the offtake of electricity that's being generated from the project itself is being taken by a federal agency or military installation or whatever. That creates an issue that has to be resolved.
Good. We have a break coming, so I want to let you have a chance to do that and mingle and meet each other. Thank you again, both to Ed and to Suedeen. Please give them a hand for joining this.